Good evening, and may I take the opportunity to say Merry Christmas to you all. It's great to be able to do that as the vicar of St. Peter's. And choir, I thought you sounded amazing. Strings, awesome. Thank you very much. I think a round of applause for them again, I think. This is one of my favorite traditions at Christmas. Candlelight, mince pies, mulled wine, great carols. And it's obviously one of yours too, because you're all here to share in the occasion. And I don't know what other traditions you share as families over this Christmas time. We have a number as a family, and we enjoy traveling into London to see the Christmas lights. We'll be doing that this coming week. We enjoy putting the tree together as a family and increasingly finding that with our three small girls that they hand you back the baubles off the tree as often as you put them on again. And our tree is slowly filling up higher and higher up, and it's looking rather bare lower down the branches. We finally have a wreath on the door of the house, which has made me especially happy. And we have a little nativity scene with a star and the shepherds, Mary and Joseph, the baby, a couple of sheep, and of course the wise men. And we follow the tradition, which has a little bit of pedigree in the church, that leading up to Christmas, the wise men travel around the house. And at the moment, they're on the top of the cupboard in the kitchen. But they'll go up to the girls' bedroom, they'll go up to our bedroom, and the girls kind of follow them around as they journey on, and eventually reaching the crib. And of course, Christmas as a whole can be subsumed in those traditions. It can feel in itself a little bit like a fairy tale, can't it? It can feel unreal. The Christmas card images that we have kind of remain with us, and they create a distance between us and the story. And it becomes much more of a myth, much more like Santa Claus or the Grinch than history. And these characters that we've heard about, read for us so beautifully tonight, they are familiar characters, but they feel somewhat at a distance. And what I want to do in a few moments this evening is to simply delve into the depths of the story, to get behind the familiar, if you like, to look at the deeper meaning. And in particular, I want to focus on what Matthew, in the middle two readings, is trying to say to us. Because I love Matthew's Christmas story. It packs in so much. One commentator described it as the gospel as a whole in one story, in one episode. And it operates on so many different levels. On the one hand, it feels familiar, but actually, as I hope we will see tonight, there's much more going on than first appears. And we're going to simply look at the three characters that make up the story. Jesus, first of all, Herod, surprisingly perhaps, and the wise men themselves. And we will see that each of them tells us two things. It tells us about God, first of all, but also it tells us about human beings. They tell us about you and me. So I want to begin with Jesus, the divine child. Matthew wants us to grasp two things about Jesus above everything else. He wants us to grasp, first of all, his divine identity. And so he introduces Jesus to us right at the beginning of this story using a variety of descriptions and titles and names. And again, you have these different levels of meaning. So he describes him right at the beginning of chapter 1 as the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, very Jewish terms. He's describing the Jewish king that had been promised by the prophets, that was expected, that was longed for by this oppressed people living in an occupied land. But there's more to it than that. The angel says, you will call him Jesus. Jesus in Aramaic is Yeshua, and it means quite literally, God saves. Why did the angel say you must call him Jesus? Well, he makes it explicit because he will save his people from their sins. What is it he's saying to us there about the identity of this child? But he goes further still. There's another level of meaning because he describes Jesus as Emmanuel, God with us. And Mohan, when he was praying, quoted the first chapter of John's Gospel, where John describes Jesus as the Logos, the Word made flesh, the Word who moved into the neighborhood, the principle that ruled and governed the universe became flesh and blood. And Joanne read for us from the book of Hebrews, which speaks of Jesus as the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being. Here, Matthew is being unambiguous. It is clear. It is bold. It is revolutionary. This child is God with us. But Matthew doesn't want us just to grasp Jesus' divinity. He wants us to grasp Jesus' humanity too. And again, we see there are these different levels of meaning. Of course, here, Jesus is a baby. He's frail. He's vulnerable. He's unable to act. He's always, do you notice, acted upon. This baby, he's a fugitive from right at the beginning of his life. He's a refugee. He's fleeing tyranny. But there's more to it, again, than that. Because Jesus is Israel. And Matthew ties in the story of Jesus to the ancient story of God's people. You have these two stories, one on top of the other. The old is retold in the light of the new. And he quotes the prophets, doesn't he? Hosea and Jeremiah. And what he's saying is that here is Jesus, the new people of God, the new Israel. Notice how he escapes slaughter, just like Moses. Notice how he escapes from Egypt, like Israel, and returns to Israel, the promised land, just like the people of God. And what Matthew is saying to us is the fate of his people is embodied and enacted through Jesus. Just as God has saved his people before, he would do so again. Just as there was an exile once that brought about the liberation of the people of God, so this was a new exile, all through this child. But do you know, there's even more than that. Because he's saying to us here that Jesus is the true human. It's not just a story about Israel. God's salvation is much bigger than that. It's about all of us. It's about humanity as a whole. He comes to rescue all of us, you and me, to live our life as the faithful human, the covenant keeper on our behalf, in our place. This is God with us, but it is also God for us. And the question is, how does humanity react when it comes face to face with the divine human? Well, one of two ways. The first is Herod, the terrified tyrant. Herod was the Jewish leader of his day. He was the actual king of the Jews, surrounded by priests and scribes. But his response to the revelation of God in Jesus Christ is fear, isn't it? He gives a human face to a hostile, overbearing state, and his view of Jesus is one of threat. He sees him as a rival. Herod appears all-powerful, but he feels vulnerable and fragile, and he chooses violence and murder. The new king threatens his claim to the throne. He threatens to expose him as a usurper, as an imposter. Jesus is the true king. He knew that, who he owed allegiance to. But there's more going on than that, you know. You see, Herod isn't just the gospel villain of this Christmas story. He's every man. He's you and he's me. This is raw human nature that we are seeing. And it is rebellious, it is hostile to the revelation of God. One commentator, Frederick Dale Brunner, said, Herod is what I am deep down. And I know that to be true of myself too. The Bible calls that sinful nature. Theologians have called it original sin. It is saying that In our essence, we are corrupt. Something is wrong. We are turned in on ourselves and are essentially selfish. And that's what we all are if we are honest with ourselves. That's why we need to be rescued. That's why we can't save ourselves. And yet, Herod still is given a chance, despite all of that. The scriptures point him to Bethlehem. But instead, he chooses what he knows, and the slaughter ensues. The good news is that the terrified tyrant isn't the only response of humanity to the divine child. Because the second response is the response of the wondering wise. The Magi, the three kings of the carols. They were probably Persian astrologers, stargazers, soothsayers, magicians, enchanters, however you might see it, scholars. You would probably say that today they would be scientists. They studied the skies. They saw something in the stars, something significant, probably the conjunction of two planets, Jupiter, which for them signified royalty and kingship, and Saturn, which signified the Jews. And coming together, this great light that they gave off said to the Magi, there was a new king of the Jews born in the land of Israel. And Matthew's saying to us, I know that, the Magi, the Bible doesn't have anything good to say about Magi in general. But Matthew wants to understand that God's grace reaches even them. That's how wide his mercy is. And their response to grace isn't fear, it's faith. It has 4 ingredients. The first thing you can see, what do? They pack their bags, don't they? They stop what they're doing and they set off in another direction and they embark on a long journey. And the Bible calls that repentance. It simply means a change of mind and of life as we turn around and follow him. When they get to Jesus, the first thing they do is they fall on their knees and they worship him. That's the first encounter there's ever been between the divine human and the world, if you like, and humanity. And worship is the response. And of course, that is how it was supposed to be. We are designed for worship, aren't we? And we all worship something. I wonder what you worship. The wise men here recognize that this child in the manger was worthy of their worship. Then they give all that they have. They give their time, they give their talents, they give their treasures. Of course, such a response was the only one that was appropriate when they'd met the divine child. And finally, they go back another way. This is a new way of living for them now. Everything has changed. Their relationships have changed. Their lives have changed. That's what the Bible says faith looks like. Change, worship, service, community. So the divine child, the terrified tyrant, the wandering wise. 2 different responses to the revelation of Jesus Christ in this Christmas story. And what that means is that Matthew asks us a question. It's the same question that he asks us every Christmas. And I would love you to reflect deeply on this question, to be ruthlessly honest with yourself, if you would. And the question is this: when you are confronted with the revelation of Jesus Christ, how will you respond? When you see the Christ child, divine and human, which character of the story will you be? Will you be Herod, responding to the grace of God with fear, the terrified tyrant? Or will you be the Magi, responding to the grace of God with faith, the wandering wise? Because that is the choice all of us have to make. Amen.